All right, thanks again for joining for the discussion session today for chapter 3 of the standards in fairness. Sergio apologizes not being here, as I said to many of you, but as you join, please remind the people who you're gonna see in your groups that he might join later. So here we go. So we want to check in for 5 minutes. Maybe we did a little bit of that, but we can separate in smaller breakout rooms and just, talk about, I have a couple of ideas that we can open this discussion about fairness in a more personal level. Then we'll have a summary of a chapter, which I hope I won't take more than 10 minutes. And the most important part probably of this is the group discussion for 20 minutes. We'll separate in breakout rooms and discuss about the chapter and ideas and questions that we have that we might be interested in asking in the Q&A session that's coming on December 3rd. And then a plenary, just, coming back, regrouping if you want, and just talking about all these issues that we talk around this chapter. The updates, I put it at the end because if Sergio comes, he's going to give us updates. If he doesn't, I'm not really aware of what those updates are, so we'll just skip it. All right. So as an icebreaker, I think it would be nice to, briefly say who you are, what are you working on, what's your research on, how are you feeling today, maybe very cold, maybe happy because there's going to be a break for most of us that are in the US next week. And particularly this is related to the fairness chapter. Do you remember a moment in which a teacher or whoever was the person was assessing you, you feared that there was an obvious unfair situation towards you or towards another person that you know of, a friend or a colleague? So how many people are we? 9. I'm just going to go ahead and divide into maybe 3 groups of 3 and take about 5 minutes, if that's okay with you. All right, so please join your groups as we start.
No.
Hello.
Hello.
Who wants to go first? Or do you know each other?
I'm sorry. No.
Oh, cool. I've never known, because of this. It's so weird to still be in Zoom all the time.
Yeah, and I missed the very first session, so I didn't do the whole group
introduction. Well, yeah. I would love to meet you, Kelly. Oh. What's your research? Where are you?
I'm a first-year PhD student at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and I also work full-time with a assessment consulting company called ACS Ventures. And so my research is very new, and we're just getting started, but I think it's going to be on how panelists make the judgments in standard setting and alignment, kind of that realm.
Cool. Maggie, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I'm Maggie. I'm a 6th-year PhD student in my dissertation phase, hopefully finishing in the spring.
Yay!
We'll see. I mean, it's been a crazy time, but I'm at CUNY Graduate Center in New York City, and my research is around looking at the actual language of standardized math test items to see how they predict diff for different student in general. So that's what I do.
That's very
really cool. Interesting.
Your research and my research are somewhat related. I also look at diff in adaptive testing in international large-scale assessments. And so somewhere in there. I am Montserrat Valdivia. I am a sixth also year student, doctoral candidate, whatever it's called. And yeah, I'm also hoping to finish my dissertation by spring or summer. Let's push it a little bit. But yeah, I'm close to that. Did you have any like unfair situations in testing at some point of your lives that you remember that you want to share?
I would say in the question, I guess I had also reading the chapters, not for me, obviously, like I have a lot of my own privilege, like with testing, but I'm really interested in like how, this question I never get answered when I ask people this, like, why don't we offer students who are English language learners assessments translated when the content's not relevant to like English language? And I always get different answers on that. So that's the more not me, but for like other people with that.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I did have one that I can remember vividly. Actually, it was in the statistics, the first class I took on college on statistics. And this is kind of silly. It wasn't, unfair because of my characteristics, but maybe, I don't know. So I got the exam, I responded. They used to give it back and then solve the exam on the, so you can compare your questions to the solutions. And everything was right, but for whatever reason, my exam was like 80 over 100. I'm like, there's a mistake writing, grading or whatever. So I approached the professor and he says, oh, sure, I'll change it. And he never did change it. And I was like, I hated statistics.
That's awful.
And that came to bite me,
Yeah,
no, later
that's
because
awful.
I did a master's in statistics and I'm pursuing a doctoral in psychometrics. So it's
kind of like a goofy way like that. I guess that's way worse. So I was in an evolutionary biology class and it was not a super math heavy class like in lecture. And so our first test, no one said to bring a calculator. I didn't bring a calculator, and the math could be done by hand, but I was like saying this long thing equals like X and Y and substituting in. But I was like, oh, like I wish I would have known. Like, it would have been 5 minutes with a calculator, but I just didn't have one. And so that was unfortunate.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Fairness in testing, right? Explaining what you need and how
people who had a calculator
administered.
did better, I bet, on that test than I did.
Right. How about you, Maggie? Do you remember any moment?
Give this example. So I'm a classroom teacher first, like a middle school math teacher, and I always give this example. So the kids were taking their state test, like their state end of year assessment, and one of the questions was had a picture of a hay bale. And it was like, it's supposed to be like a volume question, but all of my kids are here in Manhattan. So they're like all inner city kids. They've never left the city. They've never seen like a farm. They've never seen a hay bale. And so for my kids who were like native New Yorkers, they were like, I don't know what this is. What is this? And I was like, it's a hay bale. And they were like, what's a hay bale?
I'm originally from Kentucky.
They'd never seen the word. Yeah. So it was totally an unfair question for pretty much every kid in that class, unless they'd happened to go to a farm at some point.
Yeah, no, that's really, you would think they got like obvious, like we learn about obvious stuff like that in like our courses. You would think like at that level, like a statewide standardized test, they would get it together a little bit, with that, but fair.
That's crazy. Yeah.
Somebody failed their bias sensitivity review with that.
For sure, yeah.
Oh my goodness. Well, that was an excellent icebreaker. I'm happy to meet you, Kelly. I'm happy to see you again, Maggie. I know I've seen you in other sessions too. All right. I think we should come back now. I'm gonna go ahead and close all rooms. See you soon. What happened with the rest of the people?
Hey, Maggie.
Hey, Mermaid, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Really good. Good to see you.
I know, it's been a while.
Yeah.
How was the discussion in the other groups? Did you get to share some of the unfair things in your testing lives and moments? Okay. Awesome. I hope there was some conversation there around maybe unfair moments that you experience to you or towards someone else that you actually realized. I'm going to go ahead and talk about the fairness chapter. And I don't know, I was a little doubtful of put this image, but I think it works fine for this chapter. I'm going to try to be brief. So I hope if someone can remind me that I'm passing 10 minutes, but I hope I won't. So I think one of the things that we really emphasize on this chapter is that fairness is a validity issue. And I do remember there was conversation around why fairness was in a separate chapter, but this is not the first time fairness has been on a separate chapter in the standards. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But what we really want with fairness is that the scores of our tests have valid interpretations independently of the specific characteristics of an individual. Now, why did I put this picture of equity and equality? Because they sound like very similar definitions of, the words themselves, and the way we talk about them in colloquial ways are probably interchangeable, but they're actually not. So they're very different concepts. One, equity really focuses on justice and fairness in the way people are treated. And I'm not only talking about fairness in terms of testing, but in a more general way. And equality really means equal treatment, right? And the way it connects to testing throughout the standards, I feel that while well-intentioned, because clearly people are thinking about these issues, it's very confusing, these two ideas and taking them as they were equal. So I invite you to, while you'll discuss in a couple of minutes, to think about these issues in more depth and how the testing standards and how they define fairness are in relationship to equity, really, more than equality. So how fairness in testing is defined really emphasizes two ideas. One is that the same construct or constructs, if it's a multidimensional measure, for all test takers should be the same, and that scores from the test should have the same meaning for all individuals. I think these ideas really focus also on validity. And as I said before, fairness is a validity issue. And so if we think about irrelevant construct variance, it's where it really comes and impacts the way we think about these issues. So the differences, and this is something that we've been seeing in the previous chapters, so I didn't want to leave them out. Two differences are mentioned throughout the standards. One is that, of course, fairness is taken as the idea of having evidence that there is not measurement bias. Because if there is, it's a central threat to fairness in testing and validity. The difference between the old and the new standards is that these new standards talk a lot about accessibility and universal design, which was not included in the previous one. Accessibility in terms of characteristics that could impede and that are unrelated to intended constructs and limit validity of score interpretation of intended uses. So really open it up to more people who have different skills, abilities, or that could actually access, that we could access through the test to the construct that we intended to measure. And the universal design that focuses on maximizing accessibility for all intended examinees. And this is a little bit the combining part that I think of equity and equality as I read through the standards. Now, there's another difference that in terms of the chapters, the way it was organized before, I think disabilities, diverse linguistic backgrounds, and diverse cultural backgrounds, all these groups of test takers were in separate chapters. And they were in a different part of operationalizations. Whereas in the new standards, we're talking about these assessments of all the subgroups of test takers in one chapter all together. The chapter, and I hope I don't bore you too much with this, really try to focus on three different, or order itself in three ways. First, defining what fairness is as a principle of fair and equitable treatment, as a measurement of quality, as the lack of measurement bias, more like gathering evidence, and as access to the constructs being measured. Of course, this is all important when we think on the validity of score interpretation. And the way they define it is, of course, similar to how we saw it in validity, this idea of score interpretation for intended use, which takes more, I mean, it becomes more clear, I think, in this chapter when we see the last section of standards, which I'll touch in a moment. We also see threats to fair and valid interpretation of test scores, particularly when it relates to construct irrelevant variance. Throughout test context, test content, and item format, and of course the item response, right? If it's an open-ended response, or if it's a multi-group response where students have already pre-specified the definitions of the response. I'm not particularly sure why they include the fourth idea inside of the threats to fair and valid interpretations. I mean, I understand the importance of it, of opportunity to learn in terms of curriculum and instruction, and how, you know, any type of classification or high stakes test that is administered for someone who hasn't seen that curriculum or the content of that test really shouldn't have an impact on the life of that person, because that would be unfair. I do understand, and I do agree with that. However, it seems that at the same time, they kind of wash their hands when they say, well, this is a specific thing that should happen when the person who administers the test and the person who, you know, designs and gives the curriculum is the same, which is rarely the case, right, for most tests. So I wonder what's exactly going on there. I think a lot of good intentions, but very unclear for me, at least. Then it ends with test designs and testing adaptations. And really the idea is that we want to minimize construct irrelevant variance. And there are different ways that we can do that, or they propose test designers can do that. Universal design, the test accommodations or test adaptations, and of course the appropriate use of these accommodations or adaptations. What happens if, when accommodating of this designing or adapting the design, there is partial measurement of the construct, and how we should revalidate if the test modifications make into, you know, a change in the construct or something like that. This is all important because we want to compare the scores, and it's very typical that we do that across different groups. So we want that to be valid. The test standards are about 20 different that refer to fairness, and they're organized in 4 groups. Out of those 4 groups, I found that, sorry, I'm sharing in the main, oh, well, I guess that's fine. Out of the 4 groups here, I think this is particularly interesting because we don't know how people are using the data that it's being collected. And while the other ones take a lot of responsibility on the test developers and the test users, I think this is really on test users. The responsibility lays on test users, and I believe it's of long conversations, particularly because we know how sometimes these ideas around IQ or these ideas about certain groups, outrageous ideas that I don't even want to talk about are in place when some of the people use these tests. So with that, I think I've finished sharing the summary. We are 10 now. I'm gonna go ahead again and divide us in groups, and we can go ahead and talk. And I don't have the Envision board link at hand, but let me look for it and I can share so everyone can connect.
I just shared it in the chat, I think.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks, Bryce. So maybe we can open the Envision board and, as we've been working before, just post notes and ask questions, and we go ahead and vote afterwards, but try to ask as many questions that came out to you throughout the chapter. I know some people have already done that, but I think that conversation always, allows us to get more questions. So we'll have 20 minutes to do that, and then we'll come back for the plenary discussion. We're back.
I'll say I do like when we have the similar people in the first group. The first time I went, it was different people, like, oh, they reintroduce all over again.
And then I remember that too. All right. Oh, let me. Oh, that worked. All right. So I have opened the what is it? Envision board. So I'm happy to add comments or whatever. But do you have any impressions around this chapter or things that you would like to, mark for the conversation with Dr. Wick on December 3rd?
I think I'm just really interested in their take of the construct relevant variants around like the English language learners. Like that's like a really, like, I'm just really curious about that.
Mm-hmm.
I guess like it's probably a lot more expensive, I guess, to have full translations of tests. And that's probably the reason that they don't, which is sad. But I feel like it can't be, I feel like it'll be worth it with that.
Yeah, I guess on the flip side of that, it's like they've also found though, depending on what language you're educated in for that subject, like you sometimes having the test translated into your home language or your first language doesn't really do that much help for you, because, and I've seen this just anecdotally, but also like on a larger scale, it's like, like if you learn all of the math vocabulary where it's like in English, you don't know those words and you're like, you probably don't know those words in your native language necessarily, so like academic vocabulary. And so taking the test in your home language might help you to understand like the overall context of the problem better, but it's not going to help you really in some ways because you didn't learn that content in your home language.
So what's like a good alternative to that?
That's an excellent point, Maggie.
Yeah.
Especially I feel that way whenever I try to explain things in Spanish, psychometric terms in Spanish. I'm like, let me try to, use different words to try to explain ideas.
It'd be cool if like some computer test could have like you could hover over a word and like select a translation of something, with that, if that was an option. I don't know if that exists, but
Nowadays, all
right.
medicines are so much more friendly for people.
Yeah, but you have to have an accommodation to be able to like have that in your in a state test.
Mhm. Yeah, I was working on recently, it was adult ed assessment. So they weirdly kind of fall out of the K through 12 where there's not real accommodations for like ELL learners. And I was like, oh, this is unfortunate because we were doing a standard setting and like panelists are asking like, well, I feel like this item is very difficult if the student was an ELL. And I was like, well, like what do they get? Like I taught biology in high school setting for very briefly, but I like if they have accommodations, they're like, well, no, at this stage you don't. And I was like, oh, well, that's unfortunate. Like you don't, like how do you correct then for that?
I mean, right. That comes on the part, I guess, of the user as well, right?
Yeah.
Because would the inference out of the scores of that specific person, are they going to be valid? Are we actually measuring the construct of interest, or there's construct irrelevant variance there?
Yeah, I was definitely like, oh, I usually in focus so on K through 12, I don't like consider like the outside credentialing realm of testing as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I do, well, for international large-scale assessments, I do think translations are super important. But something that it's very challenging in ILSAs is the matter that we have plenty of countries, right? And more countries want to participate. But there is a lot of problems where the content itself of the question is very specific of, OECD countries. So an easy example, think about when you're asked a question about baseball in the US, most of the people, even if they don't care about the sport, will know about it. But for people outside of the US, it's kind of like, not for everyone, like for people from my country, it's completely irrelevant to their knowledge of math or physics or whatever the question is trying to point at which construct. So I think a lot of more conversational participation of how the items are written from these other countries needs to happen. And I know there are efforts in ILSAs, but I think always, pushing those efforts farther, which opens a new conversation within countries, right? Within the US, how many African Americans are participating in item construction or item building, and how item design or testing design, and how many are being represented, in these developments. Because I think something that is assumed throughout the testing standards for me was, one is that English is a norm, right? It's always English learners as the different, which sure, for most places of the US would work, but aren't these standards supposed to,
that's a really good point,
to go into a more broader situation? So, yeah. The norm of who is the norm in these standards make me think a lot about when we talk about fairness here.
Funny enough, that same client in adult ed, we really had to push for them to even care about the diversity of the standard setting panel, because they were like, we don't need to sample the like race, ethnicity, gender, like they work in the fields. They're like, that's not what this means. Like they were just so confused why that matters. Like you should want this to be representative of who your population is. And they were all white. So that's
which happens most of the time, right? I mean,
if you don't actively make sure you have these like kind of guardrails in your design, like naturally the way America is set up, it's gonna kind of work out one way, that.
well, it invites for the discussion, right? Of saying, what are we expecting from the standards, even in the language that we use.
Mhm.
For me, there was a lot of confusion about these two ideas of equity and equality. Like all the idea of universal design, sure,
Mhm.
it's great. I embrace it, but I embrace it with some caution because it really is portraying an idea of we want equality, everyone to be assessed. Do we? Do we actually? What are the implications of that? I think that's what matters, right? What are the implications of it?
Yeah, no, that's really a really good point that I didn't think of as well. I'm in my book again. Hold on.
How about you, Debbie or Maggie?
Well, I've actually worked in this field though. So, I mean, there are things that you are also not thinking about in terms of, when you have the item prompt having more complex sentences, you're going to limit the accessibility. Yeah, the more academic words there are will limit the accessibility, but when you use more academic words, for example, in math assessment, you might also limit other issues that go beyond fairness, such as like limiting the difficulty of the item or the problem solving, because specifying out, for example, what equation a student should use actually makes the item much less difficult. So there's a variety of different things. It is actually more like considered better to do backwards translation than forwards translation. But
What does that mean exactly? Sorry if I don't.
So that would be going, you take a version of the items that are in, say, Spanish, and then you backwards translate it into English to see whether it's still the interpretation is the same.
Makes sense.
I would recommend, if you're interested in more about things like that, like reading the work of Jamal Abadi. He used to be at UCLA and he's now at UC Davis.
What is the name?
A lot of Jamal Abadi, Abedi.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'm also kind of interested in, like, with the field of alternate assessment in K through 12 with that, and that's kind of considering like universal design, a whole kind of similar but other realm, like with that. So I thought it was super interesting reading it through both kind of lenses, like with it.
What do you think about the change from the previous standard to the new standard in grouping every group, disabilities, English language learners, and other, background characteristics groups?
I think it's kind of oversimplifying the issue because the accommodations like an English language learner is going to need are going to be very, very different than the accommodations somebody who maybe has some kind of disability would have. Not to say there aren't people who, we've certainly had students who are like sort of double certified where they had like the IEP and they were also an English language learner. I've had that in my classroom before, but overall, that usually people tend to have one or the other. So yeah, the kind of it's like a glossary would help an L, but it probably wouldn't help a student with special needs. Depending on what the needs are, of course. So yeah, I think it kind of oversimplifies because I think the actual like work you have to do in terms of test construction is very different for different groups.
Yeah, no, I definitely feel like this is a brief, like go read more of your specific kind of like find the handbook of test development. We can't help you here kind of thing, like with it. Like this is go more.
I like how you phrased it, Maggie, the oversimplifying the issue as, and it is not, there are some aspects of fairness that I think expecting to find, but I wonder if I love that. I don't know if you went to NCME, the meetings, and Jennifer Randall really talked a lot about these issues, and I'm so happy she's on the standards panel because I'm sure she's gonna, try to at least open conversations around other issues.
Yeah, no, she's amazing.
She is.
It is neat to like, I get kind of why they did that though, because you are kind of building your test considering not the quote unquote expected typical student, like you shouldn't build a test and then backtrack. Oh, we have to consider these accommodations now. Like you should build a test to try to be like as inclusive from the start, and so it's considering like ELLs or students who would need accommodations for like different things, like I get the point they're trying to do with that, but yeah, it's definitely an oversimplification of it.
And I think maybe to like your earlier point, Kelly, I think if we had more interim assessment, like at the end of every like unit of study, as opposed to like just like one time at the end of the school year, that might also kind of help erase some of these issues, because at least students are having a chance to show what they know at multiple checkpoints. So even if one of them is, the cost of doing that as opposed to just doing the one-off test is going to be like exponentially much higher and a lot more thought and work. But I think ultimately it benefits the student. That makes it more fair overall.
Mm-hmm. And there is a lot of work going to, I think, trying to move to more interim for a summative assessment kind of approach. Like with that, I've seen a couple of people writing about that recently, which I'm super curious about as well.
Well, school districts do interim assessments. It's just that they're not used for accountability purposes the same way that summative assessments are. Mm-hmm. And they're done at a local level rather than at a state level usually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some though are trying to get them like the map to be like incorporate into the accountability piece, and they're kind of debating about how to do that and moving more away from just one summative. I don't know how they're doing that, but I've heard people talk about that with it.
Yeah,
I think last year there was a session on that.
You could get into potential issues with that though.
Yeah.
Different districts use different item pacing maps, and so some might be covering certain standards earlier in the year, and other districts in the same state might be covering the standards later in the year. And then you actually will have an issue that certain students will have had an opportunity to learn by that point where other students won't. With the 100-day rule, where you everybody can take the assessments beginning after the 100th day of that school year, then it kind of gets rid of some of the opportunity to learn issues.
That's true as well.
All right. Any other ideas that reading this chapter brought that you would like to share?
I think to Debbie's point, they use like English language learners as an example a lot, but like we didn't give any real like concrete standards or substandards for how to actually make the tests in a simplified language that has a simplified context. I think that could probably be its own book, to be honest. But I think they could have done a little more to make it a little more explicit, like don't use lots of independent clauses and dependent clauses in one sentence and run-ons and very wordy items and things like that. Like that would have been a quick short list they could have written, and it would have been helpful, I think. So I talk to people a lot about test development, and they're always surprised that they shouldn't use these language structures and they shouldn't make really long questions because they never learned that or never heard about it.
Yeah.
Right. Well, some of those ideas though are talked about more and done a little bit behind the scenes, but you're more likely to see it on reading tests because they have to also, based on ESSA requirements, go ahead and assess the difficulty of the text, but not the difficulty of the item stems. So I was part of a group that presented, some other people like Shelby Cole, we presented at NCSA a number of years ago, talking about issues that we felt weren't being taken account in current item design.
Well, ladies, I think time is over. I'll see you in a little bit.
Great. Thanks for the conversation. This was
Thanks
really
indeed.
nice.
I love the library behind you, Maggie. Looks so nice.
Thank you. Yeah, it really helps this New York apartment to kind of buffer the sound a little bit. That's the other apartment, like the next room.
Oh, I see, I see. Well, I hope not everything's about measurement.
I mean, no, it's not. There are a few shelves about measurement. We had like a person come to fix something in the apartment once, and they looked at the bookshelf and were like, "There's a lot of boring books on this shelf."
Oh my God. It happens, it happens. Hi, Sergio, you're back.
Yes.
Great. All right, so should we debrief a little bit of what we talk? We were just 3 groups, so who wants to go first? Or should I put people on the spot? Maggie, would you mind talking a little bit of the discussion we have in our group?
Sure. So we talked a lot about the language aspect of the testing and how kind of an assumption we have is always that English is the default language of assessment, but especially if you're translating assessments for other countries for our purposes or for other students for whom English is not their first language, that creates a whole set of confounding problems that are a little bit discussed in the standards, but I think more could be said just about that whole area in general is one of our things. We talked a little bit too about how the actual standard setting panel, the actual like sort of bias review group has to be a diverse group. Otherwise, a lot of test items might seem acceptable to them, but in fact, different other cultures or subgroups would not be able to access that question. But if there's nobody on the panel to represent that group, then no one's going to kind of flag that or know. What else? We also talked a little bit about how items tend to become more difficult the more complex language you put in, and also the more complicated the items are in terms of more academic vocabulary and just longer items. And that's something to think about too, and wasn't really explicitly kind of teased out in the standards as much. What else? We talked a little bit about interim assessments and thinking about maybe that's a way to increase, if we can get kind of a good handle on how to do multiple assessments as opposed to one end of the year assessment, that might be a way to actually support fairness in some way. But again, it's a lot of things to think through because it's a lot of caveats with that and a lot of different things and how to make all schooling kind of follow one pattern. It's difficult across districts. Let's see, and I think that was pretty much everything. Anybody else in the group want to add anything else that I might have forgotten?
I think that was great. Thanks, Maggie. Anyone from the second group? Merv, maybe?
Said first of all that the chapters focus on the making sure that bias doesn't exist. Lack of bias is not equal to fairness, and that should be very clearly communicated. And also, they need to focus more on, with the pandemic and all, everything went under an evolution in terms of the testing and examination with the remote proctoring options and everything. And how would that translate into the new edition of the standards in terms of making it fair as well as keeping it standardized, if that was the purpose? And if it is not standardized, how can we bend the standardization so we can make sure that it's still fair? Subgroups. And also, subgroups are not defined in certain ways. They are more fluid in their definitions. And the idea of intersectionality, Tal mentioned that people could belong to many groups within those subgroups. So how would we make sure to define those groups in a way that is helpful to secure fairness. And also, we talked about, the language and all, as Maggie said. And the artificial intelligence scoring mechanisms are more common lately. So we were talking about how those algorithms are really sensitive to subgroup differences, or how can we use those to capture maybe like unfairness issues. What else? And also, I was talking about some test security approaches should be more systematically thought by any test users and developers, because that's a significant piece of the fairness issues. And we lastly talked about large-scale assessments and how do we make sure that cultural orientations are reflected in a way that is fair, or if it is unfair, how it is communicated to the users of the scores. Did I skip anything? Help me, group, if I skipped anything.
Thank you so much, Merv. Maybe Ashley, or who was in the third group? I think Ashley, Kimberly, Stacy, any of you, whoever wants to talk.
I can go for us. We talked a lot about the use of language in the chapter as well. Fairness, we did say it does give it some weight that it has its own chapter, which pros and cons to that. Even though it has its own chapter, there needs to be more of a discussion of it in relation to the consequences of testing. We talked about fairness and test use needs to be addressed by test developers, not just at the last minute by other parties and by test takers, test users, so on and so forth. We stated that issues arising with fairness may arise well before the newest version of the standards comes out, which is why the standards should be produced more rapidly. So there was a sticky note about maybe there should be discussions within the chapter about debates that are being had around fairness. And we were saying that would be a great idea, but because of the amount of time lapse between each issue of the standards, those debates may change before the next issue comes out, and that's problematic. So the standards need to be kept up to date with issues of things like fairness. The standards should provide a technical meaning for fairness. They use very broad statements as to what fairness is and what fairness may be seen as in various contexts, but they never just specify for their exact example of this is what we mean when we say fairness. Fairness should address both groups and subgroups and individual testing scenarios, or at least offer examples at each level. And then our final point was that fairness needs to specify what it means by opportunity to learn in better and more detailed terms.
Yes, I agree. I agree with your points too. Well, thank you so much. I think this was really, really good discussions across groups and across, all of us. So now that Sergio is here, I'm just going to pass it to him, but I would love to invite you to, keep adding questions for the Q&A session and voting also on those questions. It seems that a lot of us have similar views around issues of fairness, and clearly something that, matters a lot for most of the people who are here in this session today. So thanks again. And now I'll pass it to you, Sergio.
Yes, thank you, Montserrat. I'm sorry for all the problems that I had at the beginning. It wasn't like a good day for me today. So yeah, between issues with cell phone and connection, laptop, too many things. Well, I mean, we are going to have Rebecca Swick as the expert invited for the Q&A session. She is she's writing the fairness chapter in the new version of educational measurement. So that's why I wanted to have her in particular, because she is like the one writing the chapter that's going to be there for the foreseen future. And also she has like a big territory in the field. So I think we can take advantage there. Montserrat, can you go to the first slides, the one that have the updates? Yes, exactly. Thank you. So yeah, I send a voting for everybody to take some decisions about the next cycle of sessions for spring 2022. I was suggesting the idea of having sessions during February and March and have 4 more chapters, then stop having session during April so we can kind of breathe and have the conference in April, and then continue and finish the rest of the chapters during May and June. And well, as I said a few times before, the idea is that after the study group ends, start the process of writing a statement, ask graduate students about the new standards. So if that's the time schedule, I guess maybe starting in September 2022 could be like a reasonable date to do that. And well, I mean, I sent the voting. A few people have voted, like around 10 people so far. And you have until next Wednesday, I think it was before Thanksgiving. So yeah, take advantage of that and vote. And that's it. That's the only thing I want to kind of have some time to share with you. Yeah, and well, as Montserrat said, I mean, take advantage of the Envision board and write your questions. We need questions now for Rebecca's week. That's going to happen next week. No, not next week. In 2 weeks more. Yeah, yeah. No, Black Friday is not the. We're not having sessions while we are buying stuff. All right, that's it.